My name is Adeline Parker. I'm 35 years old, and for most of my life, I believed the wrong parent. The afternoon of my mother's funeral, a lawyer I barely remembered placed a storage key in my hand and quietly told me my mother had left something behind that my father was never supposed to touch. By then, half our town already believed the story my father had been telling for years, that my mother was slipping, that she forgot things, that she got emotional, confused, and couldn't be trusted with money anymore. I believed parts of it too, which is the part that still hurts the most. The next morning, I unlocked a storage unit off State Road 37 and found 12 years of my mother's secret journals, copied bank statements, insurance records, and one truth I was never supposed to see. My father had not been protecting my mother. He had been rewriting her life in real time. And my mother had spent years leaving a paper trail so that one day after she was gone, I would finally know which one of my parents had been lying to me all along. Bloomington looked exactly the same when I reached the edge of town. The same limestone buildings, the same small stores near the square. The town always felt like a place that paused time for people who never left. My parents' church sat 2 streets behind the courthouse. Bloomington Community Church had been there longer than I had been alive. My mother had volunteered there every Christmas drive since I was a kid. The parking lot was already half full when I arrived. I sat in the car for a minute before stepping out. Nurses know how to walk into hard rooms. Hospitals train you for that. But this felt different. The building in front of me was full of people who knew my family's story before I did. Inside the church, the air smelled faintly of flowers and old wood. Someone had arranged white lilies near the front pews. My father stood near the aisle, greeting people one by one. Thomas Parker looked composed in a dark suit I had only seen him wear at weddings and funerals. His shoulders were straight, his voice stayed low and measured as he shook hands. When he saw me, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. "I'm glad you made it home. I came as soon as I could." He held on for a moment and then stepped back. His expression carried the quiet weight people expect from a grieving husband. Pastor Samuel Ortiz approached a few minutes later and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Your mother meant a great deal to this community. Thank you." The service began soon after. Pastor Ortiz spoke about Eleanor Parker as a teacher who cared about every student that passed through her classroom. He talked about her volunteer work and her patience with children who struggled to keep up. My father stood when it was his turn. He rested one hand on the back of the pew in front of him and looked out across the room. "Eleanor was a wonderful woman for many years." His voice carried easily through the church. "But the last few years were harder." He paused briefly before continuing. "She wasn't always herself." I felt a small shift in the room as people leaned in to listen. She forgot things more often. She got emotional about small problems. And she had trouble managing finances the way she used to. I had heard versions of those sentences during phone calls over the last few years. My father would say them casually when I visited. He always sounded patient when he said them. Back then, I accepted the explanation because it seemed easier than questioning it. I watched him now as he finished speaking. Several people in the pews nodded with quiet sympathy. The service ended with a hymn my mother used to hum while cooking dinner. When people began filing out of the sanctuary, my father stayed near the front, greeting neighbors and old friends. I stepped outside to breathe for a minute. The cold November air carried the smell of fallen leaves. Cars pulled slowly out of the lot while small groups gathered near the sidewalk. That was when I noticed the woman standing near my father. She was in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back neatly. She wore a black coat that looked newer than anything most people wore to church in Bloomington. My father leaned toward her as he spoke. She placed a hand lightly on his arm while listening. I waited until they finished their conversation before walking closer. He noticed me and motioned toward her. Adeline, this is Caroline Mercer. Caroline offered a polite smile. We met through a real estate project last year. Nice to meet you. Her handshake was firm and quick. She stepped back as another person approached my father. The moment passed easily enough. Still, something about the familiarity between them stayed in the back of my mind. I walked around the side of the church toward the parking lot. The sun had begun dropping behind the buildings across the street. A man in a gray coat stood near the edge of the lot, studying a set of keys in his hand. When he saw me, he walked over slowly. Adeline Parker. Yes? My name is Benjamin Holt. The name sounded familiar before I could place it. I knew your mother for a long time. She spoke about you often. I nodded politely. Benjamin reached into his coat pocket and held out a small metal key attached to a rectangular tag. The tag read, Midwest Storage Facility. I've been holding this for Eleanor. For me? For you. He placed the key in my hand. Your mother asked that I give it to you if anything ever happened to her. I turned the tag over between my fingers. What is it? A storage unit. He looked toward the church for a moment before continuing. She believed there were things you deserved to see for yourself. She was very clear about that. I felt the weight of the key settle in my palm. Benjamin met my eyes calmly. She told me you would know when to open it. He gave a small nod and walked back toward his car. I stood in the parking lot for a few seconds, staring down at the metal tag. When I finally drove home, the house looked unchanged from the outside. Inside was different. My mother's office sat at the end of the hallway. The door stood open. The wooden desk where she used to keep stacks of papers was empty. The filing cabinet drawers hung open without folders inside. I leaned against the doorway and looked around the room. My father's voice drifted from the kitchen down the hall. We should get some rest tonight. Tomorrow will be a long day. I closed my hand around the storage key and slipped it into my coat pocket. For the first time that day, I wondered why my mother would hide something from the one person she had lived with for 40 years. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's office with the drawers hanging open and the desk cleared down to bare wood. By 6:30 the next morning, I was standing in the kitchen in yesterday's black sweater, drinking coffee that tasted burnt because my father had left the pot on too long. Thomas came in wearing jeans and a navy quarter zip, looking more like a man headed to a job site than someone whose wife had been buried the day before. You heading back to Indianapolis today? Not yet. He opened the refrigerator and took out orange juice. There's a lot to handle this week. I know. That was all either of us said. 10 minutes later, I was in my car with the storage key in my coat pocket and my mother's voice in my head, though I couldn't have told you the exact words. It was more a feeling than a sentence, the sense that she had been trying to stand in a doorway for years while nobody looked up long enough to see her. Midwest Storage Facility sat just off State Road 37, behind a strip of auto shops and a car wash. The place was practical in the way most things in southern Indiana are. Low brick office, security gate, rows of storage units with roll-up metal doors. Nothing about it looked important enough to hold a family secret. I typed in the code from the tag and drove through the gate. Unit B17 was halfway down the second row. I parked, got out, and stood there for a second with the key in my hand. The morning air had that wet November cold that settles into your sleeves. Somewhere nearby, a truck engine idled. A dog barked once and then stopped. The lock turned on the first try. When I pulled the door up, it rattled loudly enough to make me glance over my shoulder. The unit was smaller than I expected. No furniture, no boxes of old decorations, no forgotten bicycles or lamps, just a gray metal filing cabinet, 3 banker's boxes, and 1 plastic storage bin stacked neatly against the wall. My mother had always been orderly. Even her secrets were organized. On top of the filing cabinet sat a white envelope with my name written across the front in her handwriting. For Adeline. I sat down on one of the boxes because my knees suddenly didn't feel steady enough for standing. The concrete floor was cold, even through my jeans. I opened the envelope carefully, the way I might have handled a fragile chart at work, except my hands were shaking too much for that comparison to mean anything. The letter was 4 pages. My dearest Addie, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I am sorry for leaving you with questions instead of answers. I stopped there and pressed my lips together. My mother had not called me Addie years ago, not because she stopped wanting to, more because adulthood had made everything between us slightly formal and careful, the way things become when too much goes unsaid for too long. I kept reading. She wrote that she had suspected for years that my father was controlling more than he admitted, not just money, not just paperwork, the story of our family itself. She wrote that she had tried more than once to bring things up to me, but every time I came home, my father was nearby, or he had already prepared the ground by telling me she was tired, forgetful, upset, overwhelmed. She said she could see me listening to him before I ever realized I was doing it. That line hurt more than anything else on the page because it was true. At 22, when I graduated from IU and moved to Indianapolis for my first nursing job, I thought I had become the kind of woman who saw people clearly. I worked in emergency medicine. I knew what stress looked like. I knew what confusion looked like. I knew when families were lying to each other in hospital rooms. Apparently, none of that meant I knew how to see my own home. The rest of the letter was practical. My mother listed what she had stored there and why: financial records, insurance documents, journals, photographs. She wrote that if she was wrong, then I could throw all of it away and nobody would ever know. But if she was right, then I needed to read carefully and trust what was written down. I folded the letter once and laid it beside me. The first banker's box contained hardbound notebooks arranged by year, 2013 through 2025. Some years took up 1 book, some took 2. She had written dates across the front in black marker. The second box held folders of copied bank statements from Lakeside Credit Union, joint checking, savings, credit card summaries, mortgage records. Every few pages had yellow sticky notes attached to them. The third box held printed life insurance paperwork and a slim accordion file with tabs labeled tax, deed, tuition, and miscellaneous. I opened the first journal. March 2013. Thomas told me I forgot to sign the transfer authorization. I did not forget. I signed it Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen. He says I am confusing papers now. I am not. The next entry was 3 days later. He moved the money anyway. I turned pages more quickly. There was a pattern to the writing, not emotional, not rambling. My mother wrote like she was building a record for someone she hoped would one day read it without interruption. Date, event, amount given, explanation given, why she did not believe it. In folder after folder, I saw the same thing: a withdrawal followed by a note, a transfer followed by a note, a form with a signature, and then a journal entry saying she had never seen that form before. My father had spent years telling me my mother forgot things. What I had in front of me looked a lot more like someone trying desperately not to forget a single detail. I reached for a later journal, one from 2016, and opened to a page with a pink sticky note on top. September 14. Adeline's birthday package mailed at 10:40 a.m. post office receipt in envelope. Thomas said he would text her the tracking number because my phone battery was dying. He never did. He told her I must have forgotten to send it. I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. That had been my 26th birthday. I remembered opening a short text from my father that evening. "Your mom feels awful. She thought she mailed your gift and didn't. She's been off all week." I had called her after that and told her it was fine. She sounded distracted and tired. I took that as proof. My mother had mailed the package. I put the journal down and took a breath that didn't help much. A different notebook from 2018 had another sticky note. April 6th. I booked a room in Indianapolis for next weekend. Thomas canceled it from the house line after I left for church choir. He told Addie I forgot to confirm. I am beginning to understand that every mistake he assigns to me becomes true if he says it first. That was the weekend I had worked 3 nights in a row and cried in the hospital stairwell because I thought my mother had bailed on me at the last minute. I remembered the resentment, the sharp little protective loyalty I felt toward my father whenever I thought my mother had let me down. I closed the notebook and pressed my hands flat against the concrete floor until the cold registered through my skin. In the plastic bin were photographs, church picnics, Rotary fundraisers, holiday drives. My mother in cardigans and sensible boots. My father smiling at the camera with one hand in his pocket. And then, in a stack from late 2023, Caroline Mercer appeared. At first she was in the background, then closer, then standing beside my father at a church auction table while my mother smiled stiffly from the other side. I kept flipping until my stomach tightened. At the bottom of the filing cabinet, beneath a folder of copied tax documents, was a manila envelope marked August 2024. Inside was a document bearing Benjamin Holt's letterhead and my mother's name. I did not read more than the first page before I understood one thing with total clarity. Whatever my father believed he was managing after my mother's death, he was not the only one who had made plans. I slid the papers back into the envelope and sat in the quiet storage unit with my mother's letter beside me, knowing I was not going back to the house yet. I drove straight from the storage unit to Benjamin Holt's office with my mother's letter on the passenger seat and a banker's box buckled in beside it like something alive enough to need securing. His office sat above a downtown insurance agency in one of those old limestone buildings near the courthouse square. The brass plaque downstairs still read Holt and Weaver, even though I was fairly sure Mr. Weaver had died years ago. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and radiator heat. Everything in Bloomington that had lasted longer than 20 years seemed to smell that way. Benjamin opened the door before I knocked a second time. "You found it." I found more than I was ready for. He stepped aside and let me in. The office looked almost exactly the way I remembered it from childhood. Bookcases lined the walls. File boxes were stacked neatly under a window that faced the square. A framed photo of Benjamin and his wife sat beside a green desk lamp. Nothing in the room looked rushed or modern or careless. My mother would have trusted a room like this. I set the box on the edge of his desk and pulled out the envelope dated August 2024. I only read enough to know I needed to come here. Benjamin put on his glasses and looked at the documents for less than a minute before nodding. "That's a copy. You have the original." "I do." My throat tightened. "So my father doesn't know?" "Not from me." He sat down and motioned for me to take the chair across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The radiator clicked twice behind me. "How long did you know she was doing all this?" "Long enough to understand she was frightened. Of him. Of what he could do with a story." That landed harder than if he had said money or paperwork or the house. A story was exactly what my father controlled best. Benjamin folded his hands on the desk. "Your mother first came to me in 2013. That early?" She had noticed changes in the joint accounts she did not authorize, or at least not in the form they later appeared. I thought of the first journal entry I had read, March 2013, the year I was 23 and trying to survive my first year as a nurse in Indianapolis, working rotating shifts and learning how to function on bad coffee and 4 hours of sleep. Why didn't she tell me plainly? Benjamin looked at me for a second before answering. "Because you lived 2 hours away, you were building a life, and your father had already spent years preparing you to doubt her before she ever opened her mouth." I looked down at my hands. "That sounds cruel when you say it out loud." "It was cruel while it was happening, too." He said it gently, not to wound me, but not to let me escape it either. He told me my mother had never wanted a dramatic confrontation. She had not believed that would end well for anyone. She worried my father would destroy her standing in town long before any facts could catch up. She worried he would tell me she was unstable and that I would believe him, because by then I already half did. That part hurt because it was true. Benjamin slid a different folder toward me. Your mother kept copies here as well. Not everything, enough. Inside were a few duplicate pages from the journals, a small stack of insurance documents, and notes in Benjamin's handwriting. Dates, meeting summaries, questions to revisit. He tapped one form with his finger. This is the one that concerns me most at the moment. I looked down. A beneficiary change form from 2022 for one of my mother's life insurance policies. This signature looks close. Close is not the same as authentic. He leaned back. I want someone else to look at it before I say more. That someone turned out to be Rachel Kim. Benjamin called her while I sat there. She answered on the second ring, and by late afternoon I was back on the road to Indianapolis with copies of the relevant pages in a folder on my lap. We agreed to meet the next morning at her office before I returned to Bloomington. Rachel worked in a glass building north of downtown, the kind of place with clean carpets and no sentimental clutter. She was precise in a way I recognized immediately. Hospital people and finance people often share that trait. No wasted motion, no unnecessary comfort. She studied the insurance form, then laid it beside a known sample of my mother's handwriting from a notarized statement in Benjamin's file. I'm not calling this definitive. She picked up a pen and pointed without touching the paper. But the pressure changes here, the angle shifts here, and this loop is inconsistent with the samples you brought. So it could be forged. It could be irregular. Rachel slid the pages back into the folder. My preliminary view is that this deserves a deeper look. That was all she would say, and honestly, it was enough. By the time I drove back to Bloomington, the November light was already fading. I stopped downtown first, partly because I needed coffee, and partly because I didn't want to walk back into my parents' house carrying everything I now knew. Maya Torres owned a cafe near the square called Juniper Street Coffee. We had graduated high school together before our lives went in completely different directions. She recognized me the second I walked in. Adeline Parker. Maya. Her face softened. I heard about your mom. Thank you. She handed me a cup without asking what I wanted. She still remembered I took coffee black. We talked for a minute about safe things, work, Bloomington, the weather. Then she looked toward the window and lowered her voice. Your dad used to say your mom got confused with money. I felt my stomach pull tight. He said that to a lot of people. Maya gave a small shrug. Not in a nasty way, more like he wanted people to think he was taking care of her. Did anyone question it? She shook her head. He owns a business. He donates to church stuff. People hear a husband say his wife is forgetful, and they think he's being patient, not strategic. Strategic. I carried that word with me all the way home. The house was warm when I walked in. Something savory was cooking in the oven. My father was at the kitchen island, sorting through a stack of mail with his reading glasses low on his nose. There you are. I grabbed coffee downtown. He nodded, as if that explained everything. Then he took off the glasses and looked at me directly. I spoke with Laura this afternoon. She and Daniel are coming on Saturday. For what? To go over your mother's wishes. He folded one envelope and set it neatly on the counter. I want everything handled transparently. The word almost made me laugh. Instead, I put my keys down and kept my face still. Okay? We'll keep it simple. He reached for the mail again. No confusion, no misunderstandings. I stood there for one beat too long and then forced myself to move toward the stairs. That night, I placed the copied documents from Benjamin and Rachel inside my old high school backpack and shoved it to the back of the bedroom closet under a blanket. Then I washed my face, changed into pajamas, and went downstairs to sit across from my father while he watched the local news. For the first time in my life, I understood that pretending not to know something could be its own kind of preparation. Saturday came in gray and cold, the kind of Indiana morning that makes every house in the neighborhood look like it is holding its breath. By noon, the living room had been arranged for company in a way that made the whole thing feel less like family and more like a staged event. My father had moved 2 armchairs closer to the sofa and cleared the coffee table, except for a box of tissues and a leather folder he kept beside his right hand. The folder never left his reach. Laura Parker arrived first, carrying a bakery box she set on the kitchen counter without opening. She hugged me hard, and for a second I almost let myself lean into it. I still can't believe Eleanor's gone. Neither could I, but the room didn't feel built for saying true things out loud. Daniel came in behind her with his coat half-zipped and gave me the kind of awkward side hug men give when they were raised to avoid emotion, but know they are supposed to acknowledge it. Caroline Mercer arrived 10 minutes later, in a camel coat and tall boots, carrying nothing at all. She greeted my father with the ease of someone who had already been in this house enough times to stop noticing it. I watched that more than I wanted to. By 1 o'clock, everyone was seated. Laura on the sofa, Daniel in one of the armchairs, Caroline near the far end of the couch, my father in his usual chair by the fireplace with the leather folder on his lap. I took the straight-backed chair near the window because I wanted to see the whole room. Thomas folded his glasses open and looked around once before speaking. I appreciate everyone coming. He kept his voice low, measured, patient. It was the same voice he used in public whenever he wanted to sound burdened rather than controlling. I wanted us to do this together so there wouldn't be confusion later. No one answered. The furnace clicked on in the hallway. He opened the folder and removed several pages. Your mother and I discussed these things over the years. She knew I was the one who handled the finances, the insurance, the property taxes, all of it. He looked up briefly, almost kindly. She trusted me to keep things in order. Then he started reading. The document he held gave him the house, the accounts, and effective control over everything that mattered. There were polished phrases about security and management and preserving stability after a loss. My name appeared only in connection with a smaller amount to be distributed later. Laura frowned lightly, not in alarm, more in concentration. Daniel kept his eyes on the papers in my father's hands. Caroline sat very still. My father finished the last page and laid it on top of the others. Eleanor wanted continuity. He turned toward me. She knew you had your own life in Indianapolis. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to think I might accept that. Then I asked the only question that mattered in that moment. Did she tell you that herself? His eyes narrowed by a fraction, not enough for anyone else to notice. We talked about it many times. Before I could answer, there was a knock at the front door. My father looked annoyed in a way he could not quite hide. I'm not expecting anyone. I am. Every face in the room turned toward me. I stood, walked to the door, and opened it, to Benjamin Holt. He carried a dark coat over one arm and a slim document case in his hand. Rachel Kim stood beside him in a charcoal jacket with her hair pulled back neatly, looking like a woman who had stepped out of one office only because another office had become necessary. My father rose halfway from his chair. What is this? Benjamin stepped inside without waiting to be invited further. What it should have been from the beginning. Rachel followed him in and closed the door quietly behind her. Nobody moved for a second. Then Laura shifted to the edge of the sofa. "Tom, what is going on?" My father ignored her. "Benjamin, this is inappropriate." Benjamin set the document case on the coffee table and unclasped it. "What would be inappropriate is pretending I do not possess a later executed will prepared for Eleanor Parker in August of 2024. The room changed all at once, though no one said anything. It was not a dramatic change, just a pulling back of air, like a window had opened somewhere out of sight. My father straightened. "You're mistaken." "I am not." Benjamin removed a document and held it with both hands. "This instrument was signed by Eleanor in my office, witnessed and properly notarized." Thomas gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "Eleanor was not well last year." Laura turned toward him. "You never said anything about another will." Caroline looked from my father to Benjamin and then back again. Benjamin did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This document leaves the primary residence and the majority of Eleanor's personal estate to Adeline Parker." Daniel sat back slowly, as if the chair had moved under him. My father took one step forward. "That is not what Eleanor wanted. It is what Eleanor signed." The silence after that was so complete, I could hear the ice maker in the kitchen drop a tray of cubes into the bin. My father shifted his attention to me then, not to Benjamin. "Did you set this up?" I asked him to come. His jaw tightened. Rachel opened a folder of her own and placed several copies on the coffee table. I was asked to review a limited set of financial records. Her tone was professional and flat, which made every word land harder. "There are irregularities in the 2022 beneficiary change forms associated with one of Mrs. Parker's life insurance policies. There are also account movements that warrant closer review." My father let out a breath through his nose. "This is ridiculous." Rachel looked at him briefly. "It is incomplete, not ridiculous." She touched one page with her fingertips. "The signature on this form does not fully align with the comparison samples I was provided. That does not settle the matter. It does mean the form should be examined further." Laura lifted a hand to her chest. "Tom." My father turned toward her sharply. "Don't." Daniel still had not spoken. He was staring at the pages on the coffee table, as if one of them might rearrange itself if he waited long enough. Caroline was the one who moved first. She shifted a few inches farther down the couch, enough to break the line of her shoulder against my father's chair. It was a small movement. In that room, it felt enormous. Benjamin closed the file halfway, not fully, just enough to signal he was finished talking to the room and ready to move to the next step. "I will be filing the 2024 will with Monroe County Probate Court." He paused. "And the financial documentation Rachel reviewed will be forwarded for formal examination." My father looked at me again, but this time the expression had changed. The certainty was gone. In its place was something tighter and less controlled. "You have no idea what you're doing." I stayed where I was near the doorway, close enough to leave if I needed to. "I know I want the truth." No one argued with that. The room held still around us, suspended in the moment after something irreversible had finally been said aloud. By December, the house had settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the raw quiet of funeral food and closed bedroom doors, not the strained quiet of waiting for my father to walk into a room and decide what version of reality the rest of us were supposed to live in. This was steadier than that. Colder, too, maybe, but honest. I stayed in Bloomington longer than I had planned. At first, it was because there were papers to sign and calls to return and appointments Benjamin kept adding to my calendar in his careful handwriting. Then it was because leaving felt too much like abandoning my mother to a house that had finally started telling the truth. Benjamin filed the 2024 will with Monroe County Probate Court the week after the family meeting. Rachel sent a packet of documents to Financial Crimes. Detective Marcus Hill called me once to confirm receipt and ask a handful of practical questions about dates and access to records. He did not promise anything dramatic. He did not need to. The fact that someone outside the family was looking at the paperwork at all was enough to change the shape of things. There's no immediate finding. I understand. But there is enough here to warrant review. That was all he said, and all I needed him to say. My father moved through the house like a man who kept expecting someone to interrupt and tell him this had all been a misunderstanding. For the first week, he still tried to speak to me the way he always had, in the careful tone of a person presenting himself as the reasonable one. You've made this harder than it needed to be. I kept my coat on while I answered. No, I stopped helping you keep it easy. After that, we spoke less. Laura called me twice that month. The first time she cried before she got through my name. The second time she sounded older than I had ever heard her. I should have asked more questions. You believed him. I did. Neither of us pretended that was a small thing, but it was the first honest conversation I had ever had with anyone in my father's family, and I held on to that. Bloomington changed around him in slow, ordinary ways, the kind of ways that matter more in a small town than one big public humiliation ever could. Men from the golf club stopped inviting him to Wednesday lunch. No confrontation, no speech, just no more calls. Pastor Samuel Ortiz saw me at the grocery store one afternoon and took off his glasses before he spoke, as if that might make the apology cleaner. I should have been more careful with what I accepted. I looked at the rows of canned soup behind him and thought about how many years my mother had sat in those pews while people nodded sympathetically to the wrong person. She deserved that. Yes. Caroline Mercer lasted less than a month. I came home one afternoon and saw her car in the driveway with the trunk open. She was carrying a garment bag out of the front hall closet. She stopped when she saw me, but didn't smile. I'm just picking up a few things. I stepped aside to let her pass. She studied my face for a second, maybe looking for blame, maybe looking for permission to feel embarrassed. I had neither to offer. At the door, she hesitated. I didn't know everything. I believe that. She nodded once and left. By January, Maya told me Caroline had started taking listings in Martinsville instead. A smaller market, fewer questions. I moved into my mother's office after New Year's, not to sleep, just to work. The room still carried the outline of what my father had tried to erase. The lighter square on the wall where her calendar had hung. The scratches on the desk from the old sewing machine she kept there for years before retiring. I brought the filing cabinet back from the garage where he had shoved it and wiped down every shelf myself. Then I unpacked the journals. One by one, I lined them in order from 2013 to 2025. 12 years of my mother refusing to let herself be edited out of her own life. The work was quiet. Open a box, sort receipts, match dates, slide paper into folders. But each small act felt less like administration and more like restoration. I was putting her mind back into the room where he had tried to empty it. In February, while organizing the accordion file labeled tuition, I found the confirmation for the 529 account. $92,000. I sat in my mother's desk chair and stared at the number for a long time. The account had been built in steady increments over years, not one dramatic deposit, just patience, just intention, just a woman who had apparently been planning for my future while the rest of us were still arguing over what she could or could not understand. Tucked behind the account statement was a note in her handwriting. You never needed permission to want more. I laughed when I read it, which surprised me enough that I had to wipe my eyes right after. My mother had never sounded more like herself than she did on that scrap of paper. By March, I applied to the MSN program through Indiana University's School of Nursing. I filled out the forms at the same desk where she had spent years recording things no one wanted to hear. When the acceptance email came through, I printed it and set it in the top drawer under her note. My father left the house in April. Not with drama, not with an apology. He packed over 2 days, loaded his truck, and told me Benjamin could handle any remaining communication. The first truly respectful thing he had done for me was outsource himself. When the driveway finally emptied, I stood at the front window longer than I expected to. I thought I would feel triumph. Instead, I felt space. Clear, strange, almost weightless space. That spring, I planted herbs along the back fence because my mother had always meant to. I replaced the dead porch light and repainted the office walls a soft cream she used to point out in magazines. On weekends, I drove to Indianapolis for shifts and back to Bloomington for class orientation and paperwork and the slow, ordinary labor of making a house livable after too many years of performance. What I understand now is that my father did not just manage money, he managed sequence. He spoke first, interpreted first, apologized first, explained first. He controlled the order in which everyone else encountered the facts. My mother never beat him by arguing louder. She beat him by writing things down long enough for the record to outlive the performance. If you have ever had to set a boundary with family and hold it, even when nobody around you understood, then you know how quiet that kind of courage can look from the outside. If that has been your life too, I hope you tell me about it, because sometimes the truth does not arrive in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it appears line by line until there is finally enough of it that no one can keep pretending not to see it.